You push the cart down the same hallway you've pushed it down for 11 years, past the same vending machine with the flickering light, past the same nurse's station where nobody looks up anymore, and you tell yourself, the way you tell yourself every single morning at 5:40 a.m., that invisible is not the same as worthless. You are 68 years old. Your name is Ottilie Whitlock. And for over a decade you have mopped the floors of Ashgrove Regional Medical Center while wearing a gray uniform that makes people's eyes slide right past you like you are a fixture of the building itself, a water fountain, a fire extinguisher, something useful and unremarkable. You have made peace with that, or you thought you had, until the morning a doctor stopped dead in the middle of the hallway, stared at your face like he'd seen a ghost, and whispered a name that wasn't Ottilie at all. 11 years ago, when you first put on that gray uniform, you told yourself it was temporary, a bridge to get you from one life to the next. You had been someone else once. Not famous, not important in the way the world measures importance, but respected. You had spent 22 years as a surgical nurse, the kind of nurse doctors specifically requested for the hardest cases, the kind who could read a patient's vitals crashing before the machines caught up. You had a name, people said, with a certain reverence in the operating rooms of St. Agatha's Memorial, 3 states away. But life has a way of stripping titles from people the way winter strips leaves from trees. And by the time you arrived at Ashgrove, all of that belonged to a version of you that felt like a stranger. Your husband Silas had been gone 4 years by then, taken slow by a cancer that ate through his lungs and, in its own quiet way, ate through your savings too. Your daughter Larkin was grown and gone, chasing a life in a city that didn't have room in it for an aging mother who reminded her too much of grief. And your hands, the same hands that once held a scalpel steady during a 6-hour cardiac surgery, had developed a tremor severe enough that no hospital in the country would let you near a patient again. So you became a janitor, not because you couldn't do anything else, but because it was the one job left that let you stay close to the thing you'd loved most in the world. The hum of a hospital, the low murmur of doctors making rounds, the particular quiet of a place where life and death happen every day, and somehow the lights stay on and the coffee still gets made. You told yourself that pushing a mop through these halls was still, in some small way, a form of caring for people. You just did it where no one could see your face. And if this story is landing somewhere in your chest right now, if you know what it feels like to become invisible after spending a lifetime being needed, go ahead and hit subscribe. Because this channel exists for people exactly like you. People who understand that dignity doesn't disappear just because the world stops looking for it. The hospital staff at Ashgrove knew you in the way people know furniture. Nurses said "Morning, Ottilie," without really seeing you say it back. Doctors stepped around your cart without breaking stride in their conversations about golf handicaps and malpractice insurance. You didn't blame them. You understood better than most the particular exhaustion of medical work, the way it hollows out a person's capacity for small talk by 3 p.m., so you kept your head down and did your job with a precision that would have surprised anyone who bothered to notice it. Corners scrubbed at exact angles, supply closets organized with the same discipline you once brought to a surgical tray, floors that gleamed under the fluorescent lights like they belonged in a hospital twice as expensive. You took pride in it because pride was the one thing nobody could take from you twice. There was a particular resident, a young man named Dr. Weston Marsh, who had joined the hospital's cardiology department 8 months earlier, fresh from his fellowship, sharp-eyed and a little too aware of his own competence in the way young doctors often are before the job humbles them properly. He was not unkind to you. Exactly, and he simply didn't register you as a person with a history worth knowing. You were the woman with the cart. You were background noise in scrubs, and that might have remained true forever, except for one Tuesday morning in March, when a patient coded in room 412 and the hallway outside erupted into the particular controlled chaos of a hospital fighting to save a life. You were 3 doors down, restocking a supply cart. When you heard it, the change in the rhythm of footsteps, the sharpened edge in the nurses' voices, the sound of a crash cartwheel squealing against linoleum, something in you, some old and buried instinct, snapped awake before you could stop it. You found yourself standing in the doorway of room 412 without remembering the decision to walk there, watching Dr. Marsh and 2 nurses working over an elderly man whose heart monitor had gone flat and screaming, and you saw it immediately. The thing they were missing in the panic. The thing 11 years of gray uniforms hadn't erased from your muscle memory. The compressions were too shallow. The angle of the patient's neck was restricting his airway. You had seen this exact configuration of small, fixable errors 100 times in your old life, in the operating rooms where seconds decided everything. His neck, you said, and your voice came out steadier and louder than you expected, cutting clean through the chaos. Tilt his head back further. You're not getting a clear airway. Every head in that room turned toward you, the janitor, standing in the doorway with a spray bottle still clipped to your belt, giving orders in a room full of medical professionals. For a half second, you saw the flicker of irritation cross Dr. Marsh's face, the reflexive dismissal of a voice that didn't belong. And then, because there was no time for pride in a room where a man's heart had stopped, one of the nurses, a woman named Priya, who had worked with you long, enough to trust your instincts even if she'd never understood where they came from, and adjusted the patient's head exactly as you said. The compressions found their rhythm. The monitor's screaming flatline broke into a jagged, beautiful, imperfect heartbeat. The room exhaled. Dr. Marsh stood there for a moment, breathing hard, staring at the monitor and then, slowly at you. You didn't wait for thanks. You didn't want it. You turned and walked back to your cart because that was what you did. You fixed what needed fixing and then you disappeared again. The way you'd trained yourself to disappear for 11 years. But something had cracked open that day. And cracks, once they exist, have a way of spreading. 3 days later, you were mopping the floor outside the cardiology wing when Dr. Marsh approached you directly for the first time in the 8 months he'd worked there. He had a strange expression on his face. Not gratitude, exactly, but something closer to confusion. Like a man trying to solve an equation that refused to balance. Where did you learn to do that? He asked. The airway thing. That's not common knowledge. That's not something you pick up watching TV. You told him, because there was no reason left to lie, that you used to be a surgical nurse. 22 years, St. Agatha's Memorial. You watched his face change as you spoke. Watched the polite disbelief give way slowly to something more careful, more attentive, as if he was recalculating everything he thought he understood about the woman with the mop cart. He asked follow-up questions. Where exactly? What years? What your specialty had been, and you answered them plainly. Without embellishment. Because embellishment had never been your way, and it certainly wasn't going to become your way now. In a hallway, in a uniform that still smelled faintly of bleach, what you didn't know, what you had no way of knowing, was that Dr. Weston Marsh had grown up the son of a nurse who never stopped talking about a woman she'd once worked alongside, a woman with hands so steady that surgeons requested her by name, a woman who had, according to family legend, once kept a patient alive through a botched anesthesia delivery using nothing but her own calm and quick thinking while the attending surgeon panicked. His mother's stories had a name in them, spoken with something like reverence at family dinners for as long as he could remember. Ottilie. He didn't say anything that day. He wasn't sure yet. Faces change over 20 years. And grief and hard living can age a person in ways that make even the most vivid memory uncertain. But that night he called his mother, and he described your face, the particular shape of your eyes, the small scar above your left eyebrow, the way you held your shoulders, like someone bracing against a wind that had stopped, blowing years ago. And on the other end of the line, his mother went silent for a long moment before she said, in a voice thick with disbelief, "That's her. That's Ottilie Whitlock. I thought she was dead. You had no idea any of this was happening. You went home that night to your small apartment, the one with the water stain shaped like a crescent moon on the kitchen ceiling, and you ate dinner alone the way you ate dinner alone every night. And you told yourself that the conversation with Dr. Marsh had been nothing more than a strange, small interruption to an otherwise ordinary day. You didn't let yourself hope for anything more than that, because hope, in your experience, was a door that mostly opened onto disappointment. The loneliness of those years had a particular texture to it, one that anyone who has lived it will recognize immediately. It wasn't dramatic. Nobody was cruel to you, not really. It was quieter and colder than cruelty. It was the accumulated weight of being unseen, day after day, year after year, until you started to wonder whether the version of yourself that had once mattered to anyone had simply stopped existing altogether. You thought about Silas often in those years, about the way he used to watch you get ready for a hospital shift with something like awe in his eyes, Like he couldn't quite believe his luck at loving someone capable of holding a human, heart steady in her hands. You wondered what he would think of you now. Mopping floors in the same building, type where you'd once been. Someone's last line of defense against death. Some nights you let yourself cry about it. Most nights you didn't have the energy. Your daughter Larkin called sometimes, but the calls had grown shorter and further apart, the way conversations do when two people love each other but no longer know how to talk about the things that actually matter. You never told her you'd become a janitor. You let her believe you were doing administrative work at a hospital, a phrase vague enough to be technically true and specific enough to spare you both the conversation. You didn't have the strength for. Shame, you had learned, was a peculiar animal. It didn't care how unfair its presence was. It simply moved in and made itself comfortable regardless of whether it belonged there. 2 weeks after the incident in room 412, you arrived for your shift to find a note taped to your locker, asking you to come to the hospital administrator's office before you started your rounds. Your stomach dropped the way it always drops when authority summons you unexpectedly. The old fear, familiar as an old coat, that you'd done something wrong, that this was the beginning of the end of the one steady thing left in your life. You walked to that office already composing your apology in your head, already bracing for whatever correction was coming. Instead, you found the office crowded. The hospital's chief administrator, a man named Grant Holloway, sat behind his desk. Dr. Marsh stood near the window, and beside him stood a woman you didn't recognize at first, silver-haired, sharp-eyed, watching you with an expression that made your chest tighten before you understood why. It was only when she said your name, not Ottilie, but your full name, Ottilie Whitlock, spoken with the particular warmth of someone recovering something they thought was lost forever, that the pieces clicked together. This was Weston Marsh's mother. This was Corinne, a nurse you had trained nearly 25 years ago, back when she was green and terrified, and you had stayed 2 extra hours after a brutal shift just to make sure she understood how to read a coding patient's vitals before they crashed. The room seemed to tilt slightly under your feet. Corinne crossed the space between you and took both your hands in hers, and you realized distantly that yours were shaking.
"You saved my life in that operating room in 2003, she said,
her voice cracking. Not the patient's. Mine. I would have made a mistake that killed him, and you caught it before I even knew I'd made it. And then you never told a single soul that it happened, because you didn't want me to lose my confidence before I'd even built any. I have thought about you for 22 years. I told my son stories about you at every dinner table he ever sat at. And he walked into a hospital hallway 3 weeks ago and found you, pushing a mop cart. You didn't know what to say. 22 years of being unseen had not prepared you for a room full of people looking at you like you mattered. Grant Holloway cleared his throat and explained, in the careful language administrators use when they are trying not to sound as ashamed as they should, that upon learning your background, the hospital board had reviewed your file and discovered a clerical failure. From over a decade ago, your surgical nursing credentials had never properly transferred into the hospital system when you were hired for janitorial work, because the woman doing intake back then had assumed, given your application, that you had no relevant medical history at all. Nobody had ever asked. You had never volunteered it, and so for 11 years, one of the most skilled surgical nurses in the region's recent history had been cleaning the floors of a hospital that desperately needed people with exactly your expertise, and not a single person in a position to know had bothered to look closely enough to find out who you really were. There was no single dramatic moment where everything was fixed, because life rarely works that cleanly. But what happened over the following weeks felt, to you, like watching a door you'd assumed was permanently locked slowly creak open. The hospital offered to sponsor the retraining and recertification. You would need to return to clinical work, acknowledging that your tremor, while real, was manageable, enough with modern accommodations, that it needn't end your career the way it once had. Dr. Marsh, humbled and a little haunted by how close he'd come to spending a year working alongside you without ever knowing what you were capable of, personally advocated for you to be brought onto the cardiology floor in an advisory and training capacity, given your uncanny instinct for reading patients in crisis. Corinne visited you every week for coffee, not out of obligation, but because, she said, She had missed you without knowing you were someone she could miss. You called Larkin the night it all happened, and for the first time in years, you told her everything, the janitorial work, the shame, the years of silence, and now finally, this strange unraveling of a decade of invisibility. She cried on the phone in a way you hadn't heard since she was a little girl, and she said the thing you had needed to hear for longer than either of you had realized. Mom, I never stopped being proud of you. I just didn't know you thought you had to hide from me to be loved. The staff who once stepped around your cart without a glance now stop you in hallways to ask your opinion on cases. And there is a particular kind of grace in the way you receive it, not with bitterness for the years you went unseen, but with the quiet understanding that being seen now doesn't erase the woman who kept dignity intact through all the years she wasn't. You still think sometimes about the version of yourself who pushed that mop cart at 5:40 in the morning, believing her worth had expired. You think about her with tenderness now, the way you'd think about a friend who endured something hard and came out the other side whole. You are proof of something you didn't know you needed proof of, that the world's failure to notice a person's value was never, not even once, evidence that the value wasn't there. Some people spend their whole lives being overlooked, not because they had nothing to offer, but because no one ever bothered to look closely enough to find it.